I never thought the same hands I once guided to take his very first steps would be the ones to shatter my spirit and my face. I lay there, the cold, cracked linoleum of my kitchen floor pressed against my cheek, watching the crimson pool of my own blood spread toward the legs of the table I'd built for him with my own 2 hands. My son, Julian, stood over me, his chest heaving, his expensive Italian leather shoes splattered with the red evidence of his rage. He didn't look like the boy I'd raised. He looked like a predator who had finally cornered his prey. He screamed that I was a selfish, pathetic old man, a cheapstake who was dragging him down into the gutter of my own mediocrity. He told me I deserved every blow for hoarding my meager pennies while his future hung in the balance. What Julian didn't know, what he couldn't possibly fathom, was that beneath the peeling paint of this house and my stained work jackets, I was sitting on a mountain of wealth that could have bought his little world 10 times over. I was a man of secrets, and as the darkness began to tug at the edges of my vision, I made a silent vow. He wanted a war over money? Fine. I would give him a masterclass in exactly how much a father's love is worth when it finally turns to ice. My name is Elias Thorne. I'm 64 years old, and for the better part of 3 decades, I was the backbone of Thorne Maritime Logistics, a shipping empire that once dominated the Boston harbor, but that was a lifetime ago. To the world, and to my son, I am just a retired factory foreman living on a dwindling pension in a drafty house in Marblehead. When my wife, Eleanor, passed away in the autumn of 2006, Julian was only 12. I remember the salt air of the Atlantic biting at our faces as we stood by her grave. I promised her then that I would do whatever it took to ensure our son never knew the crushing weight of the Thorne family's dark financial history. I wanted him to be a good man, a self-made man. I wanted him to earn his place in the world without the corruption of unearned silver spoons. God, how spectacularly I had failed. For 20 years, I lived a lie of calculated frugality. I worked double shifts at a textile mill after the shipping business collapsed, or so I let everyone believe. I skipped vacations, wore the same 3 flannel shirts until the elbows were translucent, and even ignored the gnawing ache in my hips that the doctors called advanced arthritis. Every cent I could scrape together went into Julian's elite future fund. I sold Eleanor's vintage Mercedes. I pawned the family heirlooms. I even told Julian we had to move into this cramped 2-bedroom cottage so he could attend the Kensington Academy and later Harvard Business School. I thought I was tempering him, like steel in a forge. Instead, I was just feeding a monster that had no idea where its next meal truly came from. Julian graduated in 2021. He landed a middle management job at a high-end consulting firm downtown, and for a moment, I thought I'd crossed the finish line. I thought Eleanor could finally rest easy. Our relationship was polite, if a bit sterile. He visited once a month, usually checking his watch and complaining about the old house smell while I served him coffee I'd brewed from the cheap tins. But everything shifted on a rain-slicked Sunday in March. Julian didn't come alone. He brought Clara Vance. Clara was everything Julian thought he deserved. 29, a head nurse at Mass General with a pedigree that whispered of old money connections, even if her own bank account was likely modest. She wore an engagement ring that caught the dim light of my kitchen like a solar flare. It was a diamond so large it looked heavy on her finger, a ring I knew Julian couldn't afford on his salary. "Dad, we have news," Julian said, his voice brimming with a performative joy. He sat on my old leather sofa, the one with the duct tape over the cracks in the armrests. "Clara and I are getting married in September. We're doing it at the Blackwood Estate in the Berkshires. It's going to be the event of the season." My heart gave a heavy, hopeful thump. A wedding, a family. Maybe this was the moment Julian would finally settle into the man I hoped he'd become. "That's wonderful, son," I said, reaching out to pat his hand. Clara gave me a tight, practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. She looked at my surroundings with the kind of pity people usually reserve for stray dogs. "Your mother would have been so proud." She loved the Berkshires. But then the atmosphere in the room curdled. Julian's smile didn't fade. It just sharpened into something clinical. "There is one small hurdle, Dad. The Blackwood requires a massive deposit up front. Between the venue, the catering for 200, the floral arrangements Clara wants, and the logistics, we're looking at a gap. We need $80,000 to secure the date and the vendors." 80,000. The number was absurd. It wasn't just a wedding. It was a ransom. At that moment, something inside me clicked. A ghost of my old life, the life of a man who ran a shipping empire and knew a shakedown when he saw one, woke up. I decided, right then and there, to test the foundation of the man I had built. I decided to maintain the mask of the penniless father. "Julian," I said, my voice intentionally thin, vibrating with a fake tremor of anxiety. "Son, you know my situation. My pension is barely enough for the taxes and the heat. 80,000? I don't have $80 to spare most weeks. I've given you everything I have already." The transformation was instantaneous. It was like watching a mask melt off a statue to reveal the rot underneath. Julian didn't just get angry. He exploded. He stood up so fast he nearly knocked over my small side table. "What do you mean you don't have it?" he roared. "You've lived in this dump for 20 years. You never go anywhere. You never buy anything. Where is the money, Elias? Where did you hide the Thorne legacy? I know the shipping company didn't just vanish into thin air." Clara didn't try to calm him. Instead, she folded her arms, her expression turning icy. "Mr. Thorne, with all due respect, Julian's colleagues are all bringing their fathers into their ventures. My own father, who works in city planning, has already committed his entire savings to our future home. It's frankly embarrassing that you're sitting here crying poverty when your son is trying to make something of his life." "I can try to get a loan," I whispered, playing the part of the broken old man. "Maybe 5,000 if I use the house as collateral. But 80? It's impossible." 5,000? Julian spat the words like they were poison. "You're mocking me. You're literally sitting in a house that I'll inherit anyway, telling me you won't help me when I need it most? You're pathetic. You've always been a small man, Dad. Small and bitter." At that moment, looking into his bloodshot eyes, I realized the boy I loved was gone. Or perhaps he had never existed. He didn't see a father. He saw a vault he couldn't crack. What he didn't know, what neither of them could guess, was that in a private wealth management account at Sterling and Harrison, tucked away under a corporate shell name, sat $6 million. It was the Thorne contingency, the money I'd saved by liquidating the shipping assets before the creditors could touch them, intended for Julian's children's children. The next few weeks were a descent into a special kind of hell. Julian didn't stop. He called me at 3 in the morning, screaming into the phone about missing his window. He sent Clara's brother, a sharp-tongued prick named Jackson who worked in asset recovery, to my door to evaluate my belongings. They treated me like a senile obstacle. "Dad, I'm giving you one last chance," Julian told me over the phone on a Tuesday. "Clara's family is starting to ask questions. They think you're a derelict. If you don't come up with at least 30,000 by Friday, don't bother coming to the wedding. In fact, don't bother calling me ever again. You'll be dead to me." I didn't give in. I wanted to see how far the rot went. That Friday, they showed up at my door. Julian looked disheveled, his eyes wild. Clara stood behind him, her face a mask of calculated cruelty. They didn't come to talk. They came to pillage. They started going through my drawers, looking for hidden valuables or bank statements I might have tucked away. "Get out of my house," I said, my voice finally finding its old strength. "You've crossed a line, Julian." "I've crossed a line?" Julian laughed, a jagged, ugly sound. "You've spent my whole life lying to me. You told me we were poor so you could hoard your little pile of gold while I struggled. Well, I'm done waiting for you to die to get what's mine." He grabbed me by the collar of my flannel shirt. I saw the flash of pure, unadulterated hatred in his eyes, the kind of hate that only comes from a sense of entitlement that has been denied. "Where is it, you old bastard?" he hissed. "Where's the Thorne money?" "There is no money for you," I said clearly. "Not a single cent." That was when the first punch landed. It was a heavy, clumsy blow that caught me right in the eye, sending me reeling back into the kitchen counter. I felt the skin split, the warm gush of blood immediate, but he didn't stop. He was a whirlwind of frustrated greed. He hit me again, a closed fist to the bridge of my nose, and I heard the sickening crunch of bone. I collapsed, my legs giving out, and as I hit the floor, I felt his boot connect with my ribs. "You're a selfish, cheap piece of trash," he screamed, his voice cracking. I lay there, the world spinning, the taste of copper filling my mouth. I didn't cry out. I didn't beg. Through the haze of pain, I watched Clara. She didn't look horrified. She didn't reach for her phone to call 911. She just watched with a cold, clinical curiosity, as if she were observing a difficult surgery. "Julian, stop," she finally said, her voice eerily calm. "Not because he doesn't deserve it, but because we need him to sign the papers. If he's unconscious, he's useless." Julian stood over me, his knuckles bruised, his chest heaving. He looked down at me with a disgust so profound it should have broken my heart. But it didn't. It did something else. It cauterized it. "Next time I come back, Elias," Julian whispered, leaning down so his spit flecked my bloody face, "you'd better have a check ready. Or I'll make sure the next fall you take is your last." They walked out, slamming the door so hard the glass in the window rattled. I lay there in the silence, listening to the sound of Julian's luxury SUV roaring down the driveway, a vehicle I had secretly paid the down payment on through an anonymous scholarship grant 3 years ago. I waited until the taillights faded. Then, with a groan that felt like it was tearing my chest apart, I reached into the hidden pocket of my apron. I pulled out my phone. It had been recording the entire time. I didn't call the police. Not yet. I called a number I hadn't dialed in 15 years. A number for a man who specialized in a very specific kind of logistical restructuring. "Harrison," I said, my voice thick with blood and resolve. "It's Elias Thorne. It's time to liquidate the Thorne contingency. All of it. I have a project that needs funding, and a son who needs to learn exactly what it feels like to be truly, utterly penniless." I stared at the blood on the floor, the open loop of my life finally beginning to close. I didn't know it yet, but the beating I'd just taken was the most expensive mistake Julian Thorne would ever make. The copper taste of blood was still thick in my mouth as I dragged myself toward the bathroom sink. Every movement was an agony that radiated from my ribs to my skull, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the icy clarity settling in my chest. I looked in the cracked mirror above the pedestal sink, the same sink I'd taught Julian to shave at 10 years ago. My left eye was already a bloated, purplish mass, and my nose was skewed at a sickening angle. I looked like a man who had been discarded, a piece of human wreckage. But as I gripped the cold porcelain, I didn't see a victim. I saw a ghost coming back to life. I spent the next hour meticulously documenting everything. I took photos of my face, the bruises forming like dark clouds on my torso, and the blood spatters on the kitchen floor. Then, I sat at my small wooden desk and opened a hidden compartment in the floorboards beneath my feet. Inside was a burner phone and a ledger that Julian believed had been burned in the great shipping collapse of 2008. I didn't call an ambulance. If I went to the hospital now, the police would be involved before I was ready. And a standard assault charge was too small, too merciful for what I had planned. I needed Julian to feel the walls closing in slowly, so he could appreciate every inch of the trap. Instead, I called Silas Vane. Silas was a man I'd known since the harbor days, a fixer who operated in the gray spaces of Boston's elite. He was a man who understood that sometimes the law was a blunt instrument when you needed a scalpel. "Elias?" Silas's voice was like gravel grinding together. "I haven't heard from the ghost of Marblehead in a decade. I thought you'd finally bored yourself to death in that cottage." "I've been busy, Silas," I grunted, wincing as my ribs shifted. "I need a full tactical workup on 2 targets, Julian Thorne and Clara Vance. I want their debts, their secrets, their skeletons, and most importantly, I want to know who Julian is talking to when he thinks no one is listening." "Your own son, Elias?" Silas paused, the silence on the line heavy. "That's a dark road. He started the journey tonight," I replied, staring at the photo of Eleanor on my desk. "I'm just making sure he reaches the destination." Over the next few days, I moved like a shadow. I stayed inside, nursing my injuries with ice and cheap bourbon, letting the neighborhood think I was just a sick old man. I watched from behind the lace curtains as Julian's SUV cruised past the house 3 times. He didn't stop. He was waiting for me to break, waiting for the accident to settle in so he could come back and collect his prize. But while he waited, I was building my fortress. I met Silas in a dim corner of a diner in Revere. He handed me a thick manila envelope. "You raised a real piece of work, Elias," Silas said, sliding the folder across the grease-stained table. "Your son isn't just a consultant. He's a high-stakes gambler with a taste for offshore sports books. He's currently underwater to the tune of $212,000 with a group out of Southie, the kind of people who don't care about elite futures or prestigious last names." My heart went cold. It wasn't just the wedding. He was drowning, and he had looked at his own father as a life raft he could sink to save himself. "And the girl?" I asked. "Clara Vance? She's a masterpiece of fiction." Silas chuckled darkly. "She's not from old money. Her father isn't a city planner. He's a disgraced insurance adjuster living in a trailer in New Hampshire. She's been running a long con on Julian, thinking he's the heir to the Thorne shipping fortune. They're 2 predators trying to eat each other, Elias. They just didn't realize the old man was the biggest shark in the tank." The realization hit me like a second beating. Julian wasn't just a monster, he was a fool. He was destroying me to satisfy a woman who was only with him for a legacy that didn't exist, at least not in the way he thought. I knew my next move. I had to plant the seeds of his undoing. That evening, I called Julian. My voice was a masterpiece of frailty, a trembling whisper of a man on the brink of collapse. "Julian, son, it's Dad. You got the money?" His voice was sharp, devoid of any guilt for the blood he'd spilled 48 hours ago. I found something," I stammered. "Your mother, she had a safety deposit box at Kensington Trust. I never opened it. I was too heartbroken, but I went today. There are certificates, old bonds. I don't understand them, Julian. They look like they're worth a lot of money." I could almost hear his pulse quicken through the phone. "Bonds? What kind of bonds, Dad? How much?" "I don't know," I lied, my eyes fixed on the empty kitchen where he'd kicked me. "The bank says they need a week to verify the authenticity. They mentioned the Thorne Maritime logo was on them. Julian, if these are real, it could be hundreds of thousands, maybe more." "Don't touch them," Julian nearly screamed. "Don't do anything until I get there. Clara and I will come by tomorrow. We'll help you handle the paperwork. You're too old to be dealing with high-level finance, Dad. You could get cheated. I just want you to be happy, son," I whimpered. "I'm sorry I was so stubborn before. I didn't realize how much you were hurting." "Yeah, well, apologies don't pay the bills, Elias. Just have the documents ready." He hung up, and for the first time in days, I smiled. It was a cold, jagged expression. I didn't have any bonds. What I had was a set of forged documents. Silas had helped me create papers that looked like a fortune, but were actually a legal tether that would link Julian to the very shipping debts I'd spent 20 years hiding. But I needed one more piece of the puzzle. I needed someone on the inside. The next morning, I took a bus into the city, a grueling trip for my battered body. I went to Mass General and waited in the cafeteria until I saw Clara Vance. She was in her nursing scrubs, looking every bit the professional, the angel of mercy. I approached her table, my face still bruised, my arm in a makeshift sling. She looked up, and for a split second a flash of genuine fear crossed her face. "Mr. Thorne, what are you doing here?" she hissed, looking around to see if any of her colleagues were watching. "I'm not here to cause trouble, Clara," I said, sliding into the seat opposite her. I leaned in close, letting her see the stitches in my brow. "I'm here to offer you a deal. Because I know about your father in New Hampshire, and I know about the Vance estate that doesn't exist." She turned pale, her hand trembling as she reached for her coffee. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Save it," I whispered. "Julian is a dead man walking. He owes $250,000 to people who don't take 'I'm sorry' for an answer. He's planning to use the Thorne Maritime bonds to pay them off. But those bonds, they carry a liability clause. Anyone who signs for them inherits the debt of the company, $7 million in unpaid maritime taxes and environmental fines." Her eyes widened. She was a gold digger, but she was a smart one. She knew exactly what joint liability meant. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Because Julian hit me," I said, my voice turning to steel. "And he's going to hit you eventually when the money runs out. I want you to help me ensure he signs those papers alone. You help me, and I'll give you a way out. I'll give you enough to disappear and start over, far away from Julian and the people he owes. And if I don't, then you marry him in September," I said, standing up painfully. "And when the federal marshals come for the Thorne Maritime assets, they'll take your car, your jewelry, and your freedom right along with his. You'll be a Vance again, Clara. Only this time you'll be a Vance in a federal orange jumpsuit." I walked away without looking back. I knew her type. She would betray Julian before the sun went down if it meant saving her own skin. As I rode the bus back to Marblehead, I watched the gray waves of the Atlantic crashing against the rocks. The tension was building. The early warning signs were all there, but Julian was too blinded by the glitter of the bonds to see the storm. I didn't know it yet, but the trap was almost set. What happened next would change everything, and it would start with a simple signature. The following morning, the air in my small cottage felt heavy, like the atmosphere before a massive electrical storm. I sat in my high-backed armchair, the one Eleanor used to sit in when she read to Julian, and waited. My ribs screamed every time I took a deep breath, and the swelling in my eye had turned a sickly shade of yellow, but I felt a strange, cold energy coursing through me. At precisely 10 a.m., Julian's SUV roared into the dry in the driveway. He didn't knock. He burst through the door with the entitlement of a king entering a conquered village. Clara followed a few steps behind him. She looked different today. Her usual air of icy superiority had been replaced by a frantic, twitchy energy. She caught my eye for a fraction of a second, and I saw the flicker of our secret pact dancing in her pupils. She was terrified, and terrified people are the most reliable tools. Where are they? Julian demanded, not even bothering to look at my battered face. The bonds, Dad. Let's see them. I reached slowly into the side pocket of my chair and pulled out a weathered, leather-bound portfolio. I'd spent all night with Silas ensuring these looked authentic. The paper was heavy, cream-colored, and embossed with the Thorne Maritime Logistics seal, a trident entwined with a serpent. To a layman, they looked like a fortune. To a shark like Julian, they looked like blood in the water. I went to the vault yesterday, I said, my voice barely a rasp. These were tucked behind Eleanor's wedding dress. I think she was saving them for your children, Julian, to ensure the Thorne name never truly died. Julian snatched the portfolio from my hand. He flipped through the pages, his eyes darting hungrily over the numbers. Bearer bonds, he whispered, his voice thick with greed. Untraceable. These are worth, my God, Dad, there's nearly $400,000 in principal here alone. With the accrued interest from 2008. It's a lot of money, isn't it? I asked, watching him closely. It's enough, he said, a manic grin spreading across his face. He looked at Clara. Do you see this? This changes everything. The wedding, the house in Brookline, all of it. Clara stepped forward, her voice trembling slightly. But Julian, your father said there's a lot of paperwork. Are you sure you should just take them? Maybe we should have a lawyer look at them. I am a business graduate, Clara. I don't need a lawyer to tell me how to cash a bearer bond, Julian snapped. He turned back to me, his tone shifting into that fake, patronizing warmth that made my skin crawl. Look, Dad, you're clearly not well. That fall you took really did a number on you. Why don't you let me take these off your hands? I'll handle the liquidation, pay off the wedding vendors, and I'll make sure you get a nice little allowance every month. You won't have to worry about a thing. I looked down at my hands, faking a moment of hesitation. I don't know, Julian. It feels like I'm giving away the last piece of your mother. The bank teller mentioned something about a successor liability. He said the person who redeems these has to sign an affidavit assuming the historical responsibilities of the issuer. Julian waved a hand dismissively. Standard boilerplate garbage. It just means I'm the new owner. I'll sign whatever I need to sign. Just give me the pen. He didn't notice the way Clara's knuckles went white as she gripped her purse. He didn't notice that I was holding a pen from the Kensington Trust, a pen I had specially prepared. I pulled a single sheet of paper from the back of the portfolio. It was a transfer of title and assumption of corporate legacy document. It was written in dense, archaic legalese. Buried in paragraph 14, under a section titled Ancillary Obligations, was the poison pill. The signer would take personal legal and financial responsibility for all outstanding maritime environmental liens associated with the 2008 Thorne Logistics fleet. In reality, those liens amounted to nearly $7 million in federal fines for a toxic spill in the North Atlantic, a debt that had been technically shelved when the company went into a shell bankruptcy. By signing this, Julian wasn't just taking the bonds, he was resurrecting a monster that would swallow his life whole. Sign here, son, I whispered. And here. Julian scribbled his name with a flourish, his ego blinding him to the fact that he was signing his own death warrant. He finished the last signature and slammed the pen down. There, he said, tucking the portfolio under his arm. Finally. A little respect for the Thorne name. He didn't stay for tea. He didn't ask if I needed more ice for my ribs. He and Clara walked out of the house, Julian already on his phone, likely calling his sportsbook contact to tell them the pig was ready for slaughter. I watched them drive away, and for a long moment the house was silent. Then, I picked up the phone. Silas, I said. He signed. The bait is taken. Good, Silas replied. Now comes the tension build. I've already leaked the resurrection of Thorne Maritime's debt profile to the Treasury's Enforcement Division. They've been looking for a person of record to pin those 2008 fines on for 15 years. Julian just handed them his head on a silver platter, but as the day turned to dusk, the victory felt hollow. I walked into Julian's old bedroom. It was still exactly as he'd left it, posters of sports cars on the walls, his high school track trophies on the shelf. I remembered the night he had a fever of 104, and I stayed up for 48 hours straight, sponging his forehead with cool water, praying to a God I didn't believe in to take me instead of him. I remembered the look on his face when he won his first debate. I had been so proud. I thought I was raising a leader. How had that boy become a man who could kick his father in the ribs for a gambling debt? The tension began to grow in my gut. This wasn't just a financial game anymore. It was a psychological war. 2 days later, the first cracks appeared. Julian called me at midnight. He sounded erratic, the background noise of a loud bar thumping behind him. "Dad, those bonds. The bank. They're holding them. They said they need to verify the chain of custody with the Federal Maritime Board." "What the hell is going on?" "I told you, Julian," I said, my voice calm and steady. "They're old, they have history. You just have to be patient." "I don't have time for patient," he screamed. "The guys from Southie. They came to my office today. They sat in the lobby for 4 hours. They told me if I don't have the first 50,000 by Friday, they're going to visit my old man in Marblehead and see if he has any more furniture to break." My grip tightened on the phone. "They threatened me, Julian. They threatened everyone," he yelled. "Just call the bank, Elias. Tell them you're the one who gave them to me. Tell them it's a gift. I already signed the transfer, Julian. It's out of my hands now. You're the person of record. That's what you wanted, isn't it? To be the head of the family." He hung up on me, but I could hear the sheer terror in his breath. The pressure was mounting. He was trapped between the federal government on one side and the Southie debt collectors on the other. The next morning, Clara called. She was whispering, her voice trembling with a different kind of fear. "Elias, he's losing it. He hit the wall next to my head this morning because I asked about the wedding deposit. He's drinking, and those men, they're following us. I saw a black sedan outside my apartment all night." "Stay the course, Clara," I said coldly. "Remember our deal. When the collapse happens, you give me the location of his private ledger, the one where he kept the records of his fraudulent consulting fees. You do that, and you get your ticket out." "He's going to kill someone, Elias," she whimpered. "He's talking about extreme measures to get the bank to release the funds." "Let him talk," I said. "Just make sure you're not in the room when the door gets kicked in." I sat back in my chair, watching the gray fog roll in off the Atlantic. I could feel the escalation. Julian was hitting rock bottom, but he was doing it with his eyes wide open, clawing at everyone on his way down. The betrayal was no longer hidden. It was a visible, pulsing thing between us. I didn't know it yet, but the next 48 hours would bring a revelation that would make the beating in the kitchen look like a mercy. Julian wasn't just a gambler. He was something much, much worse. For 3 days, the silence from Julian's end was deafening. It was the kind of silence that precedes a landslide, heavy, expectant, and terrifying. I spent those hours in a state of suspended animation, moving between the kitchen and my armchair, my ears straining for the sound of a luxury engine in the driveway. Silas had confirmed that the Treasury's Enforcement Division had officially flagged the assumption of legacy document Julian signed. The trap was no longer just set, it had sprung. Julian Thorne was now the legal face of a $7 million environmental catastrophe. Then, at 2 a.m. on a Thursday, the landslide finally hit. I was awakened not by a knock, but by the sound of glass shattering in the mudroom. I didn't reach for a weapon. I sat up in bed, adjusted my glasses, and waited. Julian stumbled into my bedroom, smelling of expensive scotch and cold sweat. He looked like a man who had been through a meat grinder. His designer shirt was torn at the shoulder, and there was a dark bruise blossoming over his jaw, a gift, no doubt, from the men in Southie. "You knew," he whispered, his voice cracking like dry timber. He didn't turn on the light. He stood in the shadows at the foot of my bed, a dark silhouette of ruin. "The bank, they didn't just hold the bonds, Elias. They called the feds. They were waiting for me in the manager's office this afternoon." "I told you the Thorne name had a history, Julian," I said, my voice steady despite the hammering of my heart. "I told you there were responsibilities." "Responsibilities?" Julian let out a jagged, hysterical laugh. "They served me with a freeze order on every account I own. They're talking about piercing the corporate veil. They say that by signing that document, I admitted to knowing about the 2008 spill and actively concealing the assets. They're calling it a criminal conspiracy, Dad. I'm looking at 10 years in a federal pen." He lunged forward, grabbing the iron railing of my headboard. His knuckles were white. "Why would you do this? I'm your son, your only son. Is that what you were thinking when you were kicking me in the ribs?" I asked, leaning forward so the moonlight hit the faded yellow bruises on my face. "Were you thinking about being a son when you were calling me a pathetic old bastard while I bled on the floor?" Julian flinched, but the rage in him was too hot to be quenched by shame. That was about the money. This is my life. You've destroyed my entire life over a few bruises? It was never about the bruises, Julian. It was about the rot. You were willing to sacrifice me for a wedding you couldn't afford and a lifestyle built on gambling debts. You looked at your father and saw a resource to be harvested, not a human being to be loved. I'll kill you, he hissed, his eyes wild and unfocused. If I'm going down, I'll make sure you don't live to see the satisfaction. You could try, I said, pointing to the small bookshelf in the corner. But Silas is listening. And the recording from the kitchen the other night? It's already in a safe deposit box with instructions to be delivered to the district attorney if I so much as trip on a rug. Julian froze. The realization that he was completely outmaneuvered seemed to drain the last of the strength from his legs. He collapsed into my old nursing chair, burying his face in his hands. The guys from Southie. He moaned into his palms. They don't care about the feds. They said if I don't have $50,000 by tomorrow night, they're going to take it out of my skin. They know I can't leave the state. I'm a trapped rat, Elias. There is a way out, I said, the words tasting like ash. But you're not going to like it. He looked up, a glimmer of desperate hope in his eyes. Anything. I'll do anything. You're going to tell me about the consulting fees, Julian. The real ones. I know you weren't just gambling. Silas found the offshore accounts. You've been laundering money for Clara's connections in the medical supply business, haven't you? That's why she was so desperate for you to get the bonds. She needed a way to wash the kickbacks from the hospital contracts. Julian turned ashen. How do you know about that? I told you I'm a Thorne. We built an empire on logistics. We know how things move from point A to point B. You thought you were being clever, using your firm as a front, but you were amateur. You let Clara lead you by the nose into a federal racketeering charge. The betrayal became visible then, not mine, but Clara's. Julian realized in that moment that the woman he was ready to marry hadn't just been lying about her father. She had been using him as a human shield for her own criminal enterprise. She told me it was safe, Julian whispered. She said the hospital would never audit the secondary suppliers. She lied, Julian, just like you lied to me. She was going to let you take the fall for the Thorne maritime debt while she slipped away with the kickback money. In fact, I added, glancing at the clock, she's probably at the airport right now. I gave her a little push yesterday. Julian let out a low, guttural howl of anguish. He had lost everything, his money, his career, his fiancée, and his father, all in the span of a week. He looked at me, and for the first time in years I saw the little boy who used to be afraid of the dark. What do I do, Dad? You go to the police, I said. You turn in Clara. You give them the ledger of the kickbacks. You cooperate with the Treasury on the maritime liens. You'll still go to prison, Julian. There's no avoiding that. But you might come out with a soul. And you? He asked, his voice hollow. What happens to you? I'm going to stay here, I said. I'm going to finish my tea. And then I'm going to call my lawyer to ensure that every cent of the Thorne legacy, the real legacy, is donated to the victims of the 2008 spill. I'm closing the books, Julian. For good. He stood up slowly, his movements heavy. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't ask for a hug. He walked out of the room, out of the house, and into the cold Marblehead night. I heard his engine start, a stuttering, desperate sound, and then silence. I sat there for a long time, watching the sun begin to bleed over the Atlantic horizon. The escalation had reached its peak. The collapse was complete. But as I reached for my cold tea, my hand shook. I hadn't told Julian everything. I hadn't told him that Clara hadn't gone to the airport. I'd told her to meet me at the old Thorne pier at dawn. Because if Julian was going to be my sacrifice, I wanted to make sure the person who had whispered the poison into his ear didn't walk away with a single penny. What happened next at the pier changed the game entirely. I didn't know it yet, but the hidden truth was about to be revealed, and it wasn't about money or ships. It was about Eleanor. The old Thorne pier didn't look like much anymore, just a skeleton of blackened timber and rusted iron jutting out into the Atlantic like a broken tooth. It was a place of ghosts for me. It was where I'd stood as a young man, watching the first of the Thorne maritime ships dock under the rising sun, back when the name meant something more than environmental fines and family ruin. Now, at 5:30 a.m., the fog was so thick I could barely see my own boots. The air was a damp, biting shroud that settled in my lungs, making every breath through my cracked ribs a jagged reminder of my son's handiwork. I leaned against a rotting piling, my hand resting on a heavy manila envelope tucked into the waistband of my trousers. I wasn't alone for long. The sound of high heels clicking nervously against the salt-slicked wood announced Clara Vance before she emerged from the gray mist. She looked frayed. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a tight, severe ponytail, and her expensive wool coat was buttoned all the way up to her chin. She looked like a woman who had spent the night staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sound of a key in the lock. "You're late, Elias," she hissed, her voice cutting through the sound of the crashing surf. She kept her hands stuffed deep in her pockets, her eyes darting toward the shore as if she expected a tactical team to swarm the beach at any second. "At my age, Clara, time is a luxury. I move at the pace the world allows me," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline. I didn't know it yet, but this conversation was about to peel back the final layer of the lie I'd called my life for 20 years. "Do you have it, the offshore routing numbers you promised?" she demanded. She took a step closer, her composure cracking. "The feds are all over Julian's firm. They froze the Mass General procurement accounts this morning. If I don't get out of the state by noon, I'm done. I didn't spend 3 years playing the doting nurse to a gambling addict just to end up in a cell because his father decided to go on a scorched-earth crusade." I looked at her, really looked at her, in the dim pre-dawn light. She was beautiful in the way a polished blade is beautiful, sharp, cold, and designed for a very specific purpose. "You never loved him, did you? Not even for a second?" Clara let out a short, sharp laugh that sounded more like a bark. "Love? Julian is a black hole, Elias. He's a man-child with a prestigious last name and a chip on his shoulder the size of the harbor. I was the one who kept him upright. I was the one who told him how to talk to the medical board, how to funnel the consulting fees through the shell companies. He was a tool, a means to an end. Now, the routing numbers. Now." I reached into the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of paper. I didn't hand it to her. I held it up so the weak morning light could catch the ink. "I have something better than routing numbers, Clara. I have a confession." "What are you talking about?" she asked, her eyes narrowing. "I spent the night looking through the archives Julian thought I'd burned. I found a series of emails between a private server and my wife's old account, Eleanor's account, from 2005, a year before she died." Clara stiffened. The name Eleanor seemed to strike her like a physical blow. "What does that have to do with anything? Eleanor Thorne has been dead for decades. That's the beauty of secrets, isn't it? They don't have an expiration date," I said, moving closer until I could smell her expensive perfume, a scent that felt violently out of place on a rotting pier. "It turns out my wife didn't die because we couldn't afford the treatment. She died because someone was embezzling the Thorne Maritime Healthcare Fund. Someone who was working as a junior accountant at the insurance firm my wife trusted, a firm that was owned by your father, Clara, Silas Vance. Bran." The silence that followed was so absolute I could hear the drip of salt water from the wood into the ocean below. Clara's face didn't just go pale, it went gray. The mask of the head nurse and the old money heir disintegrated, leaving behind nothing but the daughter of a disgraced insurance fraudster who had built her life on the ruins of mine. "My father went to prison for that," she whispered, her voice trembling with a sudden, sharp edge of venom. "He died in a 6x9 cell while you sat in your Marblehead cottage playing the martyr. We lost everything because of your family's incompetence. Every cent he borrowed was peanuts compared to what the Thornes were wasting on their fleet. So Julian wasn't just a tool," I said, the realization settling into my bones with a heavy, sickening thud. "He was your revenge. You found him, you seduced him, and you led him into a life of gambling and fraud so you could dismantle the Thorne name from the inside out. You were the one who told him I was hoarding money, weren't you? You were the one who suggested he presses me for the wedding deposit." Clara's eyes flashed with a terrifying pride. "He was so easy, Elias. He wanted to be a big man so badly that he never stopped to ask why a woman like me would look twice at a man like him. I whispered in his ear every night that you were the reason he was a failure. I told him you were a miser who loved your money more than your wife. I didn't have to hit you, Elias. I just had to sharpen the knife and hand it to Julian. He did the rest with a smile on his face." The betrayal was visible now, a grotesque masterpiece of psychological manipulation. She had turned my own son into a weapon against me, using the memory of Eleanor as the whetstone. What happened next changed everything, because as Clara stepped forward to snatch the paper from my hand, a heavy, black sedan rolled silently onto the gravel at the base of the pier. The doors opened, and 3 men stepped out. They weren't feds. They didn't wear suits. They were the men from Southie, the ones Silas Vane had warned me about. They were the grit and the muscle of the underworld that Julian had invited into our lives. At the center of them stood a man with a scarred throat and eyes that looked like flat, dead stones. This was Jax, the man who held Julian's life in his hands. "Clara," Jax called out, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate the very boards beneath our feet. "We've been looking for you. And for the young Thorne heir." Clara spun around, her face a mask of pure terror. "Jax, I have the money. We're just finalizing the transfer." "The feds have the transfer, Clara," Jax said, walking slowly onto the pier, his boots thumping with a rhythmic, predatory grace. "We have a problem with Julian. He tried to sell us out to the Treasury. He thought a deal with the government would wipe his slate clean with us. He's currently in the back of the car, and he's been telling us some very interesting stories about a secret fortune his father has hidden in Marblehead." My heart skipped a beat. Julian was in the car. He had betrayed me one last time, offering me up to the wolves to save his own skin. "Elias Thorne," Jax said, stopping 10 feet away. He ignored Clara entirely now. "Your son says you're worth millions. He says you've been playing poor to avoid the maritime liens, but that the money is real. He says you have the access codes to a Sterling and Harrison account that could pay off his debt and buy us all a very comfortable retirement in the islands." I didn't move. I didn't look back at the car. I looked at the dark water of the Atlantic. I knew what I had to do. I had to let the escalation reach its inevitable, violent conclusion. "My son is a liar, Jax," I said, my voice cold and hard as the granite of the coast. "But he's right about one thing. The money is real. But it's not in an account. It's right here." I held up the envelope. In it wasn't the routing numbers, but the original Thorne Maritime Charter, the only document that could prove the Thorne legacy was still active, and the only thing the federal government needed to seize every last cent of the Thorne contingency to pay for the 2008 disaster. If I handed it to Jax, the money would be tied up in litigation for 50 years. If I kept it, they would kill me. "Give it here, old man," Jax said, reaching into his waistband for a heavy, matte black handgun. "Julian," I shouted, my voice echoing off the fog. "Julian, listen to me." The rear door of the sedan opened, and Julian was pushed out by the third man. He was beaten, his face a swollen mess that mirrored my own. He looked at me across the pier, and for the first time, I saw no greed in him. I saw only the crushing, absolute realization of what he had done. He saw the gun pointed at my heart, and he saw Clara, the woman who had orchestrated his ruin, standing by my side. "Dad," he choked out, his voice barely audible. "I didn't know it yet, Julian," I called out, my hand hovering over the icy water, "but I loved you more than the money. I just wish you'd loved me more than the lie." "Drop it, Elias," Jax roared, leveling the gun. I didn't drop the envelope. I did something much, much worse. I looked at Clara, who was already trying to edge away toward the shoreline, and I smiled. It was the smile of a man who had already lost everything and had nothing left to fear. "If I go, Clara," I whispered so only she could hear, "you go with me. I've already sent the emails to the Mass General Board. They know about the insurance fraud. They know about your father. You're not a Vance anymore. You're a Thorne now, and the Thornes always sink with their ship." I didn't wait for her to react. I stepped back, my heel catching on the edge of the rotting wood, and as the gun flashed in Jax's hand, I felt the world tilt. The cold, dark embrace of the Atlantic was waiting, and I welcomed it. But as the water closed over my head and the sound of the gunshot muffled into a dull thud, I saw one last thing through the surface. I saw Julian. He hadn't stayed by the car. He was running. He was running toward the pier, his face a mask of agony, screaming a word I hadn't heard him say with genuine feeling in a lifetime. "Dad." The hidden truth wasn't just about Eleanor's death or the money. It was about the fact that even at the bottom of the ocean, a father still waits for his son to reach for his hand. What happened next would be the final reversal, the moment where the hunter became the hunted, and the revenge plan finally moved into its terminal phase. The water didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a cold, heavy hand pulling me back into the history I had tried so hard to bury. The Atlantic in April is a cruel mistress, a liquid ice that shocks the air right out of your lungs and turns your clothes into lead. As I sank beneath the surface, the muffled crack of the gunshot still ringing in my ears, I watched the light from the pier above turn into a shimmering, distorted gray. I waited for the pain of the bullet to register, but all I felt was the numbing crush of the deep. I didn't know it yet, but the portfolio I'd held against my chest, the heavy, leather-bound fake I'd stuffed with Eleanor's old legal journals, had acted as a makeshift shield. The slug had buried itself in 200 pages of my wife's handwritten thoughts on maritime law, stopping just short of my heart. The darkness was closing in, and for a heartbeat, I considered letting it. I was tired. My ribs were a cage of fire, my eye was a swollen mess, and the sun I'd raised had just betrayed me to a pack of Southie wolves. But then, the surface of the water shattered. A dark shape plummeted toward me, a chaotic whirlwind of bubbles and limbs. A hand gripped the collar of my flannel shirt, dragging me upward with a desperate, frantic strength. I broke the surface, gasping, vomiting salt water and blood, my vision swimming. Julian was there, his face inches from mine, his eyes wide and bloodshot, fixed on me with a terror that surpassed anything I'd seen in him. He wasn't looking at me like a bank vault anymore. He was looking at me like a drowning man looks at the only shore he's ever known. "I've got you, Dad," he choked out, his voice a ragged sob as he kicked toward the barnacle-encrusted pilings. "I've got you. Don't you dare die on me. Not like this." He hauled me onto the lower dock, a slippery, treacherous ledge of rotting wood just above the waterline. I lay there, shivering violently, my lungs burning as I fought for air. Julian collapsed beside me, his expensive suit ruined, his hands trembling as he checked the hole in the portfolio still clutched in my hand. He saw the lead slug embedded in the leather, and his breath hitched. "You jumped," I whispered, my voice a hollow rattle. "Why did you jump, Julian? You could have stayed by the car. You could have let Jax finish it." Julian looked at his hands, the same hands that had beaten me in my kitchen, and let out a broken, jagged laugh. "Because when I saw you fall, I realized I didn't want the money, Dad. I just wanted the lie to be true. I wanted to believe you were the man I thought you were when I was 10. I realized if you went into that water, I'd be alone. Truly, utterly alone." But we weren't alone. Above us, on the main deck of the pier, the sound of Jax's heavy boots echoed like a funeral drum. Clara's voice rose in a shrill, panicked spike. "He's got the papers, Jax. They're in the water. If those bonds are lost, we're all dead." "Shut up, Clara," Jax roared. I heard the metallic slide of a fresh magazine being slammed into his handgun. "Get down there and get that envelope. If the old man is alive, bring him up. If he isn't, bring me his fingers. I need the biometric overrides for his Sterling and Harrison accounts." Julian's grip on my arm tightened. He looked at me, a silent question in his eyes. He was a coward and a gambler, but he was a Thorne, and for the first time in his life, he was seeing the board clearly. He saw that Clara was willing to have his father mutilated for a digital key. "Stay here," Julian whispered, his jaw setting in a way that reminded me of my own father. "I'm going to fix this." "Julian." "No," I groaned, reaching for him. "You can't. They'll kill you." "They're going to kill us anyway, Elias," he said, using my first name with a strange, tragic maturity. "At least this way, I'm the one making the choice." He started to climb the ladder, but before his head could clear the top of the pier, the world exploded into a symphony of blue and red strobe lights. The fog, which had been our shroud, was suddenly pierced by the high-intensity beams of several blacked-out Suburbans roaring onto the gravel of the beach. The logistical restructuring I had discussed with Silas Vane was finally reaching its terminal phase. "State police, drop the weapon, hands in the air." The amplified voice boomed over the water, drowning out the sound of the surf. But it wasn't just the police. Silas Vane stepped out of the lead vehicle, flanked by two men who looked less like officers and more like the kind of shadows that make nightmares look friendly. Silas wasn't wearing a uniform. He was wearing a long, gray duster, his eyes fixed on the pier with a clinical coldness. Jax didn't drop the gun. He was a cornered rat, and cornered rats bite. He spun around, leveling his weapon at the line of vehicles, but he never got the chance to pull the trigger. A single, muffled pop echoed from the tree line, the signature of a high-caliber marksman. Jax's shoulder shattered, his gun clattering to the wood as he spun and fell. Clara screamed, dropping to her knees, her hands clawing at the air. "I didn't do anything. It was Julian. He forced me. He's the one who scammed the hospital." I watched from the lower dock as Silas walked onto the pier, stepping over the groaning form of Jax as if he were a piece of discarded trash. He walked right to the edge and looked down at us. "Elias," Silas called out, his voice calm and devoid of emotion. "I told you the tide was coming in. You always were a man who liked to cut it close." "Help him," Julian yelled, his voice echoing under the pier. "My father is shot. Help him." 10 minutes later, I was wrapped in a thermal blanket, sitting on the tailgate of Silas's SUV. Paramedics were tending to my ribs and the graze on my chest, while a dozen tactical officers swarmed the pier. Julian sat 10 feet away, cuffed to the bumper of a police cruiser. He wasn't fighting. He was staring at the ground, the reality of his situation finally settling in like a heavy frost. Clara was being led away, her face a mask of hysterical fury, shouting every profanity in the book at the officers. She looked at me as she passed, her eyes full of a poison so potent it should have withered the grass beneath her feet. "You're a dead man, Thorne," she shrieked. "You and your pathetic son. I'll tell them everything. I'll tell them about the shipping fraud. I'll tell them you're a kingpin." I didn't even look at her. I looked at Silas. "Is it done?" I asked. "The feds have the ledger Julian gave me," Silas said, lighting a cigarette and leaning against the car. "Clara's medical supply kickbacks, the insurance fraud from her father's firm, the whole mess. And the Thorne contingency, the Sterling and Harrison account." I nodded. "It's been flagged as a national security asset," Silas continued with a thin, wintry smile. "The government thinks it's the proceeds of a massive international smuggling ring. They've locked it down so tight that even the president would need a court order to buy a cup of coffee with it. Your son won't touch a dime of it, Elias. Neither will the Southie crew. And the $7 million in maritime liens?" "Wiped," Silas said, blowing a cloud of smoke into the morning fog. "I leaked the documents showing the spill was caused by a faulty component from a supplier owned by, wait for it, the Vance family. The liability shifted back to Clara's estate an hour ago. She doesn't just lose her freedom, she loses every penny she ever stole." The reversal was complete. The hunter had become the hunted, and the Thorne legacy was finally clean, even if the cost had been my own flesh and blood. But as I watched the sun finally break through the gray, I realized the most difficult part of the plan was still ahead. I stood up, my body screaming in protest, and walked over to Julian. The officer guarding him stepped back when I approached. I looked down at my son, the boy I'd raised, the man who had beaten me, and the stranger who had just saved my life. "You're going to jail, Julian," I said, my voice heavy with a grief that went deeper than the ocean. "The feds have the gambling records, the fraud, and the assault. There's no way I can fix this, even if I wanted to." Julian looked up at me, the bruises on his face a mirror of my own. "I know, Dad. I deserve it. I think I've known I was going to end up in a cage for a long time. I just didn't think I'd take you down with me." "You didn't take me down," I said, reaching into my pocket and pulling out a small, tarnished silver key. I held it out to him. "This is the key to the old warehouse on the South Pier, the one place I never let you go." Julian took it with trembling hands. "What's in there?" "The truth about your mother," I said. "The letters she wrote when she knew she was dying. The letters she wrote to you, Julian. She didn't want you to have the money. She wanted you to have the Thorne heart. She knew you were getting lost even when you were 12. She begged me to let you fall so you could learn how to stand up." Julian squeezed the key so hard his knuckles turned white. "I'm sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry." "Sorry is a start," I said, turning away. "But the resolution isn't about apologies. It's about the final twist." I walked back to Silas, leaving Julian to be processed. I had one more move to make, the move that would ensure the Thorne name was remembered for something other than tragedy. I didn't know it yet, but the moral takeaway of this story wasn't about revenge at all. It was about what happens when a father finally stops being a shield and starts being a mirror. What happened in that warehouse changed Julian Thorne forever, but the price of that final lesson was something I'm still paying for today. The silence that followed the chaos at the pier was louder than any gunshot. When I finally returned to my cottage in Marblehead, the house didn't feel like a sanctuary anymore. It felt like a museum of my own failures. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Julian had shattered my nose, and stared at the dark stain on the linoleum. It was dry now, a dull rust color that seemed to mock the elite future I had tried to build. I was a man who had won every battle and lost the entire war. The physical pain was a constant thrumming companion. My ribs were taped tight, making every breath a shallow, calculated effort. My face was a kaleidoscope of yellow and blue, but the mirror told me that the man staring back was finally seeing clearly. I had spent 20 years playing a character, the humble, struggling widower, and in doing so, I had become a stranger to my own son. I didn't know it yet, but the true collapse of Elias Thorne wasn't the beating or the shooting. It was the realization that in my quest to protect Julian from the Thorne legacy, I had accidentally created the very monster I feared. I wasn't alone in that house for long. Silas Vane appeared at my door 2 days later, his gray duster smelling of cold rain and expensive tobacco. He didn't wait for an invitation. He walked into the kitchen and placed a digital tablet on the table. "Julian is being moved to the Nashua Street jail," Silas said, his voice flat. "The feds are fast-tracking the racketeering charges against Clara. They found her secondary ledger hidden in a hollowed-out medical textbook in her apartment. She was more than just a nurse, Elias. She was the architect of a $5 million insurance fraud ring. She'd been using Julian's consulting firm to wash the money for years. I closed my eyes, the weight of the betrayal pressing down on me. "And the Southie crew? Jax? Jax is singing like a canary," Silas replied, tapping the screen of the tablet. "He's terrified of the feds. He's naming names to keep himself out of a maximum security unit. But there's a problem, Elias. A problem named Harrison Reed." I froze. Harrison Reed was the senior partner at Sterling and Harrison, the man who managed the Thorne contingency. He was a man of impeccable reputation and old money bloodlines. "What about him?" "He's the one who leaked the account details to Jax," Silas said, his eyes fixing on mine with a terrifying intensity. "He wasn't just managing your money, Elias. He was using the Thorne assets as collateral for his own bad investments. When you called him to liquidate the account, he panicked. He knew he couldn't cover the missing $2 million. So he reached out to Jax and told him the ghost of Marblehead was sitting on a mountain of cash. He wanted Jax to kill you so the accounts would be tied up in probate for a decade, giving him time to cook the books." I felt the room tilt. The betrayal was coming from every direction now. Harrison had been my friend for 40 years. He had stood by Eleanor's grave. He had held Julian at his christening. "I thought the secret was safe with him," I whispered, the words tasting like poison. "I thought he was the one person I could trust. In this world, Elias, trust is just a liability you haven't paid for yet," Silas said. "But here's the kicker. Harrison is currently trying to flee the country. He's at his estate in Newport, packing his life into a private jet. If he leaves, we never get the $2 million back, and the Thorne legacy remains a black hole of fraud." "What do you need from me?" I asked, standing up with a grimace of pain. "I need the Thorne heart," Silas said. "The physical charter you had at the pier, the real one. The feds think it's a legend, but I know it exists. It's the only document with the original maritime seal that can bypass Harrison's digital overrides. With that charter, I can freeze Harrison's personal assets and recoup every cent he stole from you." "The charter is in the warehouse," I said, "the one on the South Pier." But as I said the words, a cold shiver ran down my spine. I hadn't been to that warehouse in 15 years. It was the place where I'd locked away Eleanor's final days, the place where the true story of the Thorne collapse was written. I had given the key to Julian, but Julian was behind bars. "I'll go," I said. "I need to see it one last time anyway." The drive to the South Pier was a journey through a graveyard of industry. The rusted cranes and abandoned shipping containers looked like the bones of giants. When I reached the warehouse, a squat, windowless brick building, I saw that the lock had already been tampered with. The heavy steel door was slightly ajar. My heart hammered against my ribs. I pulled a small, snub-nosed revolver from the glove box, a relic from the shipping days, and stepped out into the rain. The air inside the warehouse was thick with the scent of cedar, old paper, and the lingering, ghostly perfume of my late wife. "Julian?" I called out, though I knew it was impossible. I walked toward the back, where a small office had been carved out of the storage space. The door was open. I stepped inside and stopped dead. The room had been ransacked. Filing cabinets were overturned, and Eleanor's letters, the ones I'd told Julian about, were scattered across the floor like fallen snow. But it wasn't the mess that stopped my breath. It was the woman sitting in my old leather desk chair. It was Clara Vance. She wasn't in custody. Her face was bruised and she had a crude bandage wrapped around her arm, but her eyes were burning with a manic, triumphant light. "The feds are slow, Elias," she said, her voice a jagged whisper. "And my connections in the medical supply world have very deep pockets. A little bribe here, a procedural error there, and I was out the back door of the precinct before the sun was up." "You shouldn't have come here, Clara," I said, raising the revolver. "Oh, put that toy away," she scoffed, gesturing to the shadow behind the door. A man stepped out, one of Jax's associates I recognized from the pier. He had a submachine gun leveled at my chest. "I'm not here for the money anymore, Elias. Harrison Reed already told me the money is gone. I'm here for the truth." She held up a single, yellowed piece of paper. It was a medical report from 2006, Eleanor's report. "I found it, Elias," she said, a cruel smile spreading across her face. "The reason you've been living like a pauper, the reason you've been testing Julian, it wasn't about teaching him a lesson, was it? It was about the guilt." "Give me that paper," I hissed. "Eleanor didn't die because of the embezzlement," Clara read aloud, her voice dripping with venom. "She died because she refused the experimental treatment that could have saved her. She refused it because she found out that you were the one who had authorized the toxic dump in the North Atlantic. She couldn't live with the fact that her life was being bought with the blood of the ocean. She chose to die rather than be complicit in your legacy." The walls of the warehouse seemed to close in. The secret I had kept from everyone, even Silas, was out in the open. I hadn't been protecting Julian from the Thorne legacy. I had been trying to outrun my own sins. I had authorized that dump in 2005 to save the company from bankruptcy, thinking no one would ever know. But Eleanor had found out. She had looked at me with a disgust that had haunted my dreams for 20 years, and then she had let the cancer take her. "Julian needs to know," Clara said, standing up. "He needs to know that the father he just jumped into the ocean to save is the man who killed his mother. He needs to know that the Thorne heart is black and rotten to the core. He'll never believe you," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "He will when I show him the signed authorization for the dump," she said, tapping a second document on the desk. "It was right here, Elias. Tucked into the back of your Precious's charter. You kept the evidence of your crime in the same place you kept your fortune. How poetic." She tucked the papers into her coat and nodded to the gunman. "Kill him. Burn the warehouse. Let the Thorne legacy finally end in smoke and ash." The gunman stepped forward, but before he could pull the trigger, the warehouse was flooded with a blinding white light. The massive cargo doors at the far end of the building groaned open, and the sound of a dozen high-powered engines filled the space. It wasn't the police. I didn't know it yet, but the revenge plan I had set in motion had a final, unexpected participant. Julian wasn't in the Nashua Street jail. He was standing in the doorway of the warehouse, silhouetted against the morning light, flanked by the very men from Southie he had supposed to be terrified of. "Clara," Julian called out, his voice echoing through the vast space with a cold, terrifying authority I had never heard before. "The feds didn't let me out. I made a new deal, a Thorne deal. What happened next was the final reversal. I had spent my life trying to keep Julian out of the family business, but as I watched him walk toward us, I realized he hadn't just joined the business, he had taken it over. But as Julian reached the office door and looked at the papers in Clara's hand, I saw the exact moment the final twist took hold. He didn't look at the gunman. He didn't look at Clara. He looked at me. And in his eyes I saw the death of the father-son relationship forever. "Is it true, Elias?" he asked, his voice a low, vibrating hum of pure pain. "Did you kill her?" I thought the secret was safe in the warehouse, but I was wrong. Someone had been there before me, and the resolution of this story was about to become a tragedy of biblical proportions. The air in the warehouse felt like it had been sucked out by a vacuum, leaving nothing but the smell of old dust and the crushing weight of 20 years of silence. I looked at Julian, my son, my legacy, my greatest failure, and I saw the ghost of the man I used to be staring back. He wasn't a gambler in that moment. He wasn't a victim. He was a thorn, and he was demanding an accounting of the soul. "Did you kill her, Elias?" he repeated, the name hitting me harder than any punch he'd ever thrown. I looked at the yellowed medical report in Clara's hand, then back at Julian. The revolver felt heavy in my grip, an anchor pulling me down into the dark water of the past. "I didn't pull the trigger, Julian," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "But I built the cage she died in. I authorized the dump to save the company. I thought I could buy our way out of the consequences. I thought if I had enough money I could protect you from the world I was creating." "You didn't protect me," Julian roared, his voice cracking the silence of the warehouse. "You lied to me. You made me believe we were poor while you sat on a fortune built on poison. You let me grow up hating you for being a failure when all along the only thing you failed at was being human." Clara let out a cold, triumphant laugh. "See, Julian? I told you. He's a monster. He's the reason Eleanor is gone. Now, give the word. Let's finish this and take what's left of the Thorne accounts. Jax's men are ready. We can walk away from all of this." Julian turned his gaze toward Clara. For a second, I saw the old Julian, the one who could be led by the nose by a pretty face and a promise of easy money. But then his eyes shifted, becoming as hard and cold as the Atlantic. "You're right, Clara," Julian said, stepping closer to her. He is a monster. But he's a monster who stayed. He's a monster who took the hits. You're just a parasite. Julian, what are you doing? Clara stammered, her smile faltering as the Southie gunmen shifted their aim toward her. I didn't make a deal with the feds to get out, Clara, Julian said, his voice dropping into a terrifyingly calm register. I made a deal with Silas Vane, and I made a deal with Jax. You see, the Southie crew doesn't like being used as a distraction for insurance fraud. And Silas? Silas doesn't like people who target the Thorne legacy. He's been the silent partner in my father's life for 30 years for a reason. The warehouse doors groaned as more figures emerged from the shadows. Silas Vane stepped into the light, followed by a team of men in dark windbreakers. Not police, not feds. These were the specialists Silas had cultivated over a lifetime of logistical restructuring. Clara Vance, Silas said, his voice echoing through the rafters. You're a very talented con artist, but you made one fatal mistake. You thought the Thorne family was just a bank account. You forgot that we are a fleet, and a fleet always protects its flagship. Clara tried to bolt, but the gunmen she thought were hers blocked the path. Jax himself stepped forward, his arm in a sling, his face twisted in a sneer. You told me the old man had the codes, Clara. You told me Julian was the weak link. But Julian showed me the ledger you kept, the one where you were planning to cut me out of the hospital kickbacks. In a frantic, last-ditch effort, Clara raised the documents. I have the proof. I'll go to the press. I'll destroy the Thorne name. The name is already destroyed, Clara, I said, stepping forward, the thermal blanket falling from my shoulders. I reached out and took the papers from her trembling hand. She didn't fight me. She was a broken bird, finally realizing the sky had fallen. The Thorne maritime name died 20 years ago. All that's left is the truth. I turned to Julian. I held out the papers, the medical report, and the signed authorization. You want the truth, son? Here it is. Take it to the feds. Use it to buy your freedom. Tell them everything I did. Tell them about the dump, the fraud, the secret accounts. I'll go to prison. I'll spend the rest of my life behind bars if it means you can start over. Julian took the papers, his eyes searching mine. I saw the struggle in him, the rage, the grief, and a tiny flickering spark of the boy who used to believe I was a hero. He looked at the documents for a long time. Then he did something that changed the trajectory of our lives forever. He walked over to a rusted oil drum in the corner of the office. He pulled a lighter from his pocket and flicked it. The flame danced in the dim light. He touched it to the edge of the maritime authorization, the evidence of my greatest sin. Julian, no, I shouted. That's your leverage. That's your way out. I don't want a way out that's built on your blood, Dad, Julian said, watching the paper curl and blacken into ash. He tossed the burning medical report into the drum, following it with the insurance fraud records. I'm a Thorne. For better or worse, I'm your son. I'll take the racketeering charge. I'll take the gambling fraud. I'll serve my time. But I'm not going to be the one who finishes what Clara started. We stood there, father and son, watching the secrets of our family burn in a rusted barrel. The revenge I had planned, the cold, meticulous dismantling of Julian's life felt hollow now. I had wanted to teach him a lesson about money, but he had taught me a lesson about loyalty, a dark, twisted kind of loyalty, but loyalty nonetheless. Silas walked over and placed a hand on my shoulder. The feds are 5 minutes out, Elias. Harrison Reed has been picked up at the airport. Clara and Jax are going into the system. What do you want to do? I looked at Julian. He was being led toward a car by Silas's men, but he stopped and looked back at me one last time. There was a letter, Julian, I called out. In the back of the charter. I didn't read it. I wanted you to be the first. Julian reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, cream-colored envelope. He had found it before I arrived. He didn't open it. He just held it against his heart. I already read it, Dad, he said, his voice thick with emotion. She knew. She knew about the dump. But she also knew you did it because you were afraid of losing us. She didn't refuse the treatment to punish you. She refused it because she didn't want to live in a world where you thought you had to be a criminal to be a father, she said. She said the greatest gift you could ever give me was the truth, even if it hurt. The car door closed, and Julian was gone. The resolution of the Thorne legacy didn't happen in a courtroom or a bank. It happened in the quiet years that followed. I didn't go to prison for the toxic dump. The evidence had burned in that warehouse, and Silas had made sure the Maritime Board looked elsewhere. But I didn't keep the money. I liquidated the Sterling and Harrison accounts, the full $6 million. I didn't give it to the feds, and I didn't keep a cent for myself. I spent 3 years systematically and anonymously setting up a foundation for the families of the sailors affected by the 2008 spill. I sold the cottage in Marblehead and moved into a small one-room apartment in the city, back to the life of the pauper I had pretended to be. Only this time, it wasn't an act. It was a penance. Clara Vance is serving 15 years in a federal facility in Connecticut. Her father's firm was dismantled, and the name Vance has become synonymous with the very fraud she tried to pin on us. She reached out to me once, a letter begging for money for an appeal. I didn't answer. Some loops are better left closed. Julian served 4 years for his role in the gambling and the consulting fraud. I visited him every week. We didn't talk about the money. We didn't talk about the Thorne Empire. We talked about Eleanor. We talked about the Atlantic. We talked about how to build things that don't sink. When he was released last spring, I was waiting for him at the gates. He didn't have a luxury SUV. He had a duffel bag and the same tarnished silver key I'd given him. "What now, Dad?" he asked, looking at the gray Boston skyline. "Now," I said, handing him a simple worn hammer I'd bought at a hardware store. "We go back to the pier, not the Thorne Pier, the public one. They need a new boardwalk. And I think it's time we learned how to build something together without any secrets in the foundation." I never thought the same hands that had beaten me would be the ones to help me rebuild my life. But that's the subtle moral of the Thorne story. A father's love isn't measured by what he provides, but by what he's willing to lose to find his son again. The money was a curse, a glittering lie that nearly drowned us both. But the truth? The truth was, the shore we finally reached. I'm 68 now. My ribs still ache when it rains and my eye never quite opened all the way. But as I stand on the boardwalk with Julian, the salt air filling my lungs, I realize that I'm finally wealthy. Not in bonds or offshore accounts, but in the simple, honest work of a man who has nothing left to hide. What happened next changed everything, not because of a twist or a reversal, but because for the first time in 20 years, I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I was just a father, standing next to his son, watching the tide come in. And for a Thorne, that was the greatest victory of all.